In this video lesson, we're going to cover Isaiah chapters 3, 4, and 5. I hope everybody is doing well on this Wednesday. I don't know about you, but for me, it's been just absolutely wonderful to get back together to worshiping once again on Sundays. We mentioned last Sunday when we were together that we're going to set a target date of June the 21st for the time when we will resume all of our regular assemblies once again. That'll be the Sunday Bible class and the Wednesday Bible class, as well as the worship services on Sunday. If we need to discuss that further, please get on the chat and let's do that. But that's kind of the target date for now. I'm very excited about that, and I hope you are too. Until we can do that, though, we'll continue with these video lessons for our Wednesday evening Bible study. If you want to turn your Bible to Isaiah chapter 3, that is where we will resume our study. You may recall that in Isaiah chapters 1 and 2, the book began with this great indictment that God had against his people for their sin, the sin of abandoning God and not putting their trust in him. You may think of chapters 3, 4, and 5 in a sense as kind of the evidence that supports that indictment. Just like you would do in a court of law, you bring a charge and then you have the details that support the charge. And so that's what God is doing here. Having brought the basic picture in chapters 1 and 2, now he will lay out some of the specifics. You should also remember the picture that we noted in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, that in the last days the mountain of the house of the Lord would be exalted above all the mountains, and the nations will stream to it and say, "Let us go to Jerusalem and let us learn about the God of the Jews." You remember that text there. And so he will teach us concerning his ways, and we will walk in his paths. And we noted that beautiful messianic picture. So how is God going to get from here to there, as it were? How is God going to bring about this wonderful, glorious future? Well, as we're going to see repeatedly throughout this first part of the book, that the path from Judah's present condition to that future glory does not lie in its human leadership. It is not the kings of Judah, specifically the ones that are mentioned at the very beginning of the book, the kings in which times Isaiah worked, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. That these are not going to be the men who bring this about. What we have instead is a scathing indictment in chapter 3 of Judah's human leadership, the ruling elite of the people. They have corrupted Israel. They have not made the people and the nation what it is supposed to be. And for this, they will enter into judgment. So the picture is that they should not get their hopes up into thinking that Isaiah is preaching that if they continue on their course, that these kings will lead them to this glorious future. Because the fact is that these kings are only going to lead them to judgment and destruction. The glorious future of Israel does not lie in the accomplishment of the kings of Judah, but in the accomplishment of a coming divine king, ultimately the Messiah. And so as we turn now our attention to Isaiah chapter 3, we have here the continuation of this judgment. And so in the first 15 verses, we have an oracle of doom against Judah and Jerusalem. And God is going to remove everything that made Judah arrogant and proud. He's going to remove the bases upon which their sense of self-sufficiency rested. And so you see here in the first 3 verses, God is going to remove supply and support, the whole supply of bread. He's going to take away their bread and their water, their food supply, all the things that they rely on to live from day to day. But not only that, all the positions of power are going to be stripped away. You'll notice the various metaphors here: the mighty man, the warrior, the judge, the prophet, the diviner, the elder, and of course, prophet here not in the sense of a good prophet like Isaiah, but of false prophets. The captains, the counselors, the enchanters, all of these people who had status in that society, the people who were considered to be the great men and the leaders. God says, I'm going to turn everything upside down. And this is going to be a constant theme throughout the book of Isaiah, that God is going to reverse the present situation. The high will be made low, the low will be exalted, the many will become few, the few will become many, that God is going to completely upend this situation because it is not what he wants it to be. And so you have all of these people here, the pride and the sense of status in these verses. And you'll notice that there is no king that is mentioned in these verses. That's kind of an interesting omission because we would expect the king to be mentioned. That has led some scholars to question, why isn't the king mentioned? Has the king become simply a figurehead? Is he simply following the advice and the counsel of these other people? Who knows if that is the case? But you'll notice the picture that God paints here, that all society from top to bottom is going to fall completely apart. The leaders in whom they trusted will be replaced by people who are completely incompetent. And so you see that in verse 4 here, that I will make mere lads their princes, and capricious children will rule over them. In other words, these terms are being used not in the good sense of the humble or, like Jesus speaks of children, but in the bad sense. People who don't know what they're doing, people with no experience, people with no understanding are going to take the place of these high and mighty people. The complete social order will be overturned, and the sense that the elite have of their power and their excellence will be gone. And so the people will be oppressed, each one by his neighbor. The youth will storm against the elder, the inferior against the honorable. There's that sense of everything getting turned completely upside down. And in verses 6 and 7, we see the opposite of the first two verses. Whereas we saw this picture of the high and the mighty, the people of status with all of their titles, here we see that nothing will be left to brag about. A man will lay hold of his brother and say, hey, oh, you own a coat. You've got more than us. You be our ruler. And these ruins that we're living in will be your domain. You see how sarcastic the picture is there. And this person will say, I can't do anything for you. I won't be your healer. I don't have any resources. Don't make me your king. And so it's going to go from this situation of the arrogant ruling over others to a position of complete nothingness, of all ideas of entitlement and power and prestige completely gone, because God will have removed everything. In verses 8 through 12, we find out why. Jerusalem has stumbled and Judah has fallen, because their speech and their actions are against the Lord, to rebel against his presence. They have made themselves the enemy, and God therefore will destroy those who are his enemies. And they have made themselves his enemies by both their speech and their actions, by refusing to turn to God, by turning to human help instead, and trusting in man and trusting in themselves. They have made themselves, as it were, the God of their own situation. They have trusted in others when they should be trusting in God. And God says, for this refusal to turn to me, for leaving me out and abandoning me, you will suffer the result of that, of the consequences of punishment. And it's not that Israel didn't know. You see here in verse 9, the expression of their faces bears witness against them. And of course, just reading the text off the page, it's sometimes hard to imagine what it is that Isaiah is speaking about here. But it seems to be that God is referring to even the expressions on their faces are expressions of rebellion and apathy, the expressions of people who just don't care, who don't want God around, and you can even see it in their faces, as it were. They are openly rebellious, openly sinful. They don't even try to conceal it, the prophet says. Their rebellion is shameless and deliberate and intentional. And so, because they have chosen this wickedness, God is going to bring upon upon them, the evil that they have deserved. In verses 10, 11, and 12, again, we have one of these little glimmers of hope. There will be a faithful remnant. We'll hear more about them again here in a moment. It'll go well with the righteous, but woe to the wicked. It will go badly with them. They will get what they deserve. And verse 12 kind of summarizes the picture, the central message that was introduced in the first couple verses of this chapter, that the human leadership of Judah has brought this coming catastrophe upon them. In a sense, the human leadership of Judah is already like a bunch of children, incompetent, unknowing, unstable. Another way to say that is that these great men of Judah who think of themselves so highly, God says they're more like women than they are men. And of course, Isaiah is using there, and God is using the prevailing attitude of the day. The Bible is not here saying that women are inherently inferior to men or anything like that. But that's how women were generally understood in the ancient world, that a woman could never be the equal to a man. A woman in the ancient world is always inferior to men. And that's the image that God is using here, that they think of themselves as great men, and God, using kind of their own value system, says, well, to me, they more look like what you would call a woman. And you'll notice that the indictment ends again by pointing the finger directly at the leaders, those who guide you, lead you astray, confuse the direction of your paths. Of course, there's all kinds of great lessons here that we could take away from the book as we're going through it, and we don't want to ignore those. Of course, anyone who wants to be a leader of God's people needs to think about passages like this, the awesome responsibility that that entails. It is not without significance that both here and in the book of Jeremiah, when God lays the blame upon various groups within the nation for what they've done, that the leadership come very, very early in the process. That the leaders made the people this way, and they must be judged. Well, verses 13 through 15 then summarizes this idea of judgment. Like a proceeding in a court, God stands up to make his charge, to contend with his people and to judge, and he enters into judgment with the elders and princes. In other words, the leaders, and he says, you are the ones who have devoured the vineyard. We'll hear more about that vineyard in chapter 5, but he lays the blame firstly at their feet, that they have crushed God's people, they have rubbed their faces in the dirt, as it were, and they have had no sense of what is fair or right or true or just, that they have lived only for their own interest. We're going to see this picture developed again in chapter 6. And you have to remember that in the ancient world, that this would have been the kind of the social norm. As we've talked about in other contexts, there is this great divide in the ancient world between the rich and the poor. There are a very few rich people, the elite, who own most of everything and have all of the power, and the poor live basically at their mercy. And so this is that picture here in Isaiah chapter 3. that these people, these elite, have abused their situation, and it has ruined the entire nation. The rest of the chapter, you'll notice the subheading here in the English Bible, Judah's women denounced, because it is addressed here to the daughters of Zion. Who are these daughters of Zion? Well, some have taken them to be the wives of the rulers, or perhaps, to state it more generically, the elite, wealthy women of Judah and Jerusalem. We might then ask, well, why would God single them out? I mean, these women were not judges or princes or things like that, so why would God single them out? One answer could possibly be, if you think about women like Jezebel, women who are in positions of power, married to people who are strong and powerful men, these women can create a lot of damage and wreak a lot of havoc in their own little spheres. They can do injustice as well. And so one possible answer as to why God singles out the daughters of Zion here is that there are a group of elite women who have contributed to the downfall of this society by their abuse of their situation and status. But I think it's also possible that the daughters of Zion stands more generally as a metaphor for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. That this is not just an indictment against the women or the elite women, but against all the people, and especially the leaders here in chapter 3, as they have abused their post and their position. Remember, God had said here that they are like women. Women rule over them. And so this is probably, I think, well understood to be God simply carrying that metaphor forward a little bit more. That these leaders are like women, and the worst kind of women, these conceited, arrogant, rich women who are concerned only for themselves, completely materialistic, covering themselves in the objects of wealth and displaying their status, and completely blind to everything else. And so even though all the imagery is that of a woman, I think a good case can be made that God is here indeed talking about the situation of the leadership of Israel or Judah in general. And so notice the picture here. They live in pleasure and in wealth. They have heads held high, mincing steps. They wear anklets, headbands, ornaments, earrings, bracelets, veil, just kind of showing off their wealth, covered head to foot in all of these trinkets, showing their privilege and their status. And again, God is going to reverse this situation. And so he's going to afflict the scalp of the daughters of Zion with scabs. That would have been a shameful thing for a woman to appear that way in the ancient world, and make them lose their hair. Their foreheads will be bare or bald. Of course, the beauty of a woman in the ancient world is very often tied very closely to the beauty of her hair. And so when God removes the hair of a woman and gives her this scalp with scabs, it's a picture of ugliness in Isaiah's world. That he's going to take these women who are so vain and proud and bring them down and give them an ugly appearance. They will go to being widowed and alone. You'll notice how everything is going to be turned upside down. Instead of the smell of sweet perfume, the smell of stench of rottingness. No longer wearing a belt, but a rope. These are pictures of captivity, a plucked out scalp, sackcloth, being branded as a captive. So God is going to take them from these high and lofty positions, these positions of privilege and status, and bring them down to humiliation. Rather than women with great men, their men will fall by the sword. and these women will be left destitute, poor, with no one to take care of them. And again, even though all of the imagery here is that of a woman who is stripped and humiliated, again, I think it's probably best to read this as a picture of the people and especially the leadership as a whole. The chapter division is unfortunate because chapter 4 and verse 1 goes with this same picture. And so 7 women will take hold of one man in that day, saying, "We'll eat our own bread, we'll wear our own clothes, but let us be joined to you. Take our name away from us. Take our reproach away from us." That they will be desperate to escape the condition that has come upon them. And so the proud will be emptied of all of their pride, reduced to humiliation and despair. And this desire that they had to be independent of God leads them to a kind of dependence of the lowest order, a shameful, humiliating kind of helplessness. From there, we go then to, once again, one of these great pictures of future glory. And so we just saw that God is going to take this situation where the leadership of Judah has ruined everything, and he's going to strip these people of their power and their privilege and their wealth and all of their titles and their ranks and make them low and abased and shameful and humble. But God, of course, will not completely wipe out his people. This is one of the great themes of Isaiah, that God will judge the wicked. He will remove the wicked, but the righteous will be left. And that's what this branch of the Lord here is. The New American Standard Bible has capitalized the word branch here because, in the opinion of the editors, they think this might be a reference to Jesus. But I think if you look at the context, this is not really a reference to a particular individual, although the Messiah is called the branch in other contexts. I think what we have here instead is the branch refers to the remnant, the survivors, as you see here later in the parallelism of this same verse. And so the branch, and this is going to lead up to chapter 5, the vineyard image, that God is going to take away all of the vineyard except for a branch that will be left. And from this righteous branch will grow the new nation of faithful people. So that's what we have here. The survivors, the remnant, the leftover righteous will be beautiful and glorious, and God is going to bless them with the fruit of the earth. They will be adorned in all of the good things that God gives them. The survivors will be the faithful ones. You see in verse 3 that those who are left in Zion are going to be the holy ones. And it is these people who have not defiled themselves with materialism and arrogance, people who have turned to God when they should have, that these are the people whom the Lord says will live. You'll notice as we look at this text in particular, but also throughout these early chapters of the book, that we have these kind of back and forth pictures going on. That we have the present with its sin, iniquity, wickedness, and corruption. And then we have the text breaking us to the scene of the future, where there is righteousness, holiness, and everybody loves the Lord and wants to be with the Lord, and they turn to him. And then the text will go back to the present situation and then look ahead again to this situation of future glory and righteousness. So the present versus the future. And really, in a sense, I think you could say without a whole lot of risk of overstating, that herein lies kind of the essence of the main message of Isaiah. That those who are faithful to the Lord will have a beautiful and glorious existence. and the wicked will disappear. And the whole book, therefore, becomes this call to stop being the people who have abandoned God in their attempt to run their own affairs, and to become the people who are righteous and who love God and who draw near to Him and find their help in Him. And so, in contrast to the Israel of Isaiah's day, who had abandoned God, who had exalted herself, made herself her own God, in a sense, taken the seat of God for herself, and is attempting to run her own kingdom and her own life. In contrast to that, we have this picture of the righteous, who make God God, and who serve God in the humility of loyalty. So God is going to create that situation. And verse 4 makes it very clear how all of this is going to happen. How is God going to go from present to future? How is He going to go from this people who are not trusting Him, the majority, to a people who will all trust in Him? And we hear about it in verse 4, that the Lord will wash away their filth and purge the bloodshed in Jerusalem with a spirit of judgment and burning. And we're going to find out as we go through chapter 5 here that God is going to bring a purging fire, the fire of exile, the fire of judgment. He's going to destroy the wicked. And what will be left after the exile is all over are the righteous. And so it is by a process of judgment, fiery, consuming judgment and fierce anger, that God will eliminate the wicked from His people, and He will leave only the righteous behind. And the situation that will result then will be a picture kind of like it was back there in the time of Sinai. And so it'll be, as it says on the chart here, a return to the pristine relationship of Sinai. The Lord will create over the whole area and over her assemblies a cloud by day and a fire by night. That's language taken out of the Exodus, obviously. For over all the glory will be a canopy. There's several things going on here, and it's important to kind of get the picture that Isaiah is painting here. You remember that as God led Israel through the wilderness, that the cloud and the fire was before them and in the camp. And the picture that Isaiah is painting here of the faithful who will remain is that they will be like that, in the sense that they will be following God's leadership, that they will be going where God wants them to go. They will not be following their own ways. Human leaders will not be leading the way. They will be following God. But it's going to be even greater in a sense than it was in the time of Moses, because in the time of Moses, when Israel came out of Egypt, you remember that the glory of the Lord sat over the tabernacle, and nobody was allowed to go in there except the priests, and Moses sometimes went in there. But here the picture is even bigger, that the glory of the Lord will be over all of Mount Zion, that the whole place will be a temple, that all of God's people will be inside, as it were, that they will all be part of this new temple picture. They will no longer be away from God, separated by a distance, but all of God's people will be near Him, close to Him. The glory of the Lord will overshadow them, and this glory, this pillar of fire and smoke, that it will be like a canopy over them that shelters them and gives them protection. And so it is a picture of God and His people dwelling together. They are faithful to Him, and God is protecting them. And that is the way that God always wanted this relationship to be. And so it will be kind of a going back to this relationship and it being the way that it's supposed to be, not the way that Israel in Isaiah's day had made it to be. Well, that brings us then to chapter 5, one of the more famous parts of the book of Isaiah. We have in the first 7 verses a parable, the parable of the vineyard. Notice what God says. He had a vineyard. God dug around it, removed the stones, planted it with the choicest vine, built a tower in it, hewed out a wine vat. I mean, the picture is that God planted Israel like you would plant a vine in a vineyard. And he cleared out all the weeds. He cleared out all the things that would cause interference. He took care of it. He dug the ground up so that it would be fertile and receptive. He expected it to produce fruit. He hewed out the wine vat for when the wine and the grapes would come in. And so the picture is that God did everything that he possibly could. He gave it his very best care. And of course, God did something for them, and they were supposed to produce fruit for God in return. This is how the covenant works, right? Reciprocity. God has done something for us. He expects us to serve him and be loyal to him in return. And so God had done his part, and he expected it to produce good grapes. And this sense is also heightened by the language in verse 1. You'll notice beloved, beloved, beloved. 3 times in that one verse, we hear about the vineyard being God's beloved. And that suggests this picture of intimacy, of a husband and wife kind of thing, that God entered into this relationship with an expectation of faithfulness. And he did his part to the one that he loved, and he expected his beloved to treat him in return with blessing and reciprocity. But we hear in verse 2, God only got worthless grapes out of this vineyard. It never produced the fruit it was supposed to produce, the fruit of faith, the fruit of loyalty, the fruit of righteousness and holiness. Israel did not become those things. So God says to the people of Judah, you tell me, what should I do to a vineyard like this, where I've poured all of this work and effort into this thing, and it produces absolutely nothing in return? What more was there to do that I have not done, when I expected it to produce good grapes and it only produced worthless ones? What do you do with a vineyard like that? Well, everybody would have known the answer. You tear it up, you dig it up. It's worthless. And so that's what God says I'm going to do. I'm going to remove its protective hedge. I'm going to allow others to come in to consume it. I'm going to break down its wall and it will be trampled. I'm going to dig it up, lay it waste. I'm not going to take care of it anymore. It will become the dwelling place of all kinds of unfruitful things, and I will not let the rain come upon it. In other words, it must die. I will lay it waste, God says. Verse 7 summarizes the whole picture. The vineyard is the house of Israel. The men of Judah are his plant. And so Judah is the vine that God planted. And God wanted to get justice and righteousness out of them. That's the fruit that this vineyard was supposed to produce. But all God ever got was bloodshed and the cry of people who were being treated unfairly and unjustly. That injustice and sin reigned in this place. There's a very famous play on the words. It's not often that biblical authors use kind of a pun or a play on words, but in the original words, in the Hebrew here, justice and bloodshed are 2 words that sound very similar to each other, and righteousness and distress are 2 words that sound very similar to each other. And so I looked for this, but I got something may sound like it in the original Hebrew, but it's actually a different thing altogether. The rest of the chapter is a series of 6 woes that further spell out the complaint that God has. And so we'll look at those just very briefly here as our time is coming to a close. Verses 8, 9, and 10, we have a picture of the accumulation of houses and land, the accumulation of power and wealth. And of course, this is a picture of greed, of selfishness, of self-interest, where people are confiscating lands and houses when they can, robbing their neighbor of their places. And of course, you have to remember in this ancient Israelite world that you have your ancestral home. It was given to you as part of the allotment of the land. Each tribe and each family in the tribe got their family farm, and that's what kept you alive. That's what sustained you from year to year. And if somebody took your land, you had nothing because your land was the source of your life. And so here are people who are taking the houses and lands of other people. And the picture, if we kind of fill in the spaces there, is of the powerful and of the greedy who are able to exploit the weakness of other people in difficult times and take away everything that they've got. And there's no more, you're living alone in the midst of the land. You've confiscated every farm all around you, and you have no neighbors anymore, is the idea. And so here are people who have become wealthy at the expense of the lives of other people. They have controlled and oppressed others wrongfully. And so God says, your houses are going to become empty, and 10 acres of vineyard will yield 1 bushel or 1 quart of wine. You see the a vat there is approximately 10.5 gallons. And of course, 10 acres to produce 10 gallons of wine, that's almost nothing. And this is a vineyard that is producing almost nothing. You see kind of the irony here that God had just accused his vineyard of producing nothing. God says, that's what I'm going to do to yours. And again, the fields. Um, a homer of seed will produce but an ephah, about 1 bushel of grain. Normally, a bushel of seed should produce hundreds of bushels of grain in return, but this will produce very, very, very little. Verses 11 through 17 are the second woe. This continues this picture of a self-indulgent people, paying attention only to themselves, their own pleasure, their own desires, and completely ignoring God. And so the picture is all they want to do is they want to get drunk. You know, this is the picture of their own pleasure. That's all there is on their mind. That what I want to do, I just want to, do what I like to do. And they have these banquets with music and tambourine and flute, and that's all they care about. Nobody's asking, what does God want? Should I be doing something different? They pay no attention to God and to his works. They are completely ignoring God and thinking only of themselves. Another way of saying that is that the devotion that they should have been giving to God, they give only to themselves. So God says, I'm going to send them into exile for their lack of knowledge, for not knowing me. And again, we have this theme of reversal, that the honorable will be famished, the multitude will be parched with thirst, the banqueting, the sumptuous living, all is going to be reversed, and these people are going to be in need. And it's going to be like going into death. Going into exile will be like being swallowed up by Sheol, like going into the grave. That will be the punishment for these people. Keep this in mind, because in chapter 26 we're going to hear about this again. If going into exile is like going into the grave, the coming out of exile is like resurrection. But we'll see that later on, but I just kind of want to kind of plant that reminder here. And so, like we heard in chapter 2, man will be humbled and abased. The proud will be abased, but God will be exalted. Again, the picture is that God should have been exalted. People should have been turning to God. They should have been honoring him, but instead they have taken the honor that was due God and they gave it to themselves. They made themselves God in a sense. They have made themselves at the top and forgotten about God. And God says, I'm going to set it right. I'm going to put myself back in the place where I'm supposed to be, and I'm going to take them out of that place of arrogance, and I'm going to put them in their place. God will be exalted, and the proud will be put down. And then this lamb or this land will become as if it wasn't ever occupied. These people will be gone, in other words. The lambs will graze, strangers will eat in the waste places of the wealthy, because God will have removed them all. The next woe, verses 18 and 19, again attacks their materialism. They drag iniquity with the cords of falsehood and sin as if with cart ropes. The picture here is of cargo, a freight that is being hauled. And what is the freight that they have? What is the possession that they have hoarded and accumulated? Well, they have stored up for themselves iniquity and sin. So that is what God sees their wealth as, that you have hoarded and accumulated and piled up sin, and you transport it around like dragging a load with a cord or with a cart rope, putting it on a cart and tying it down and so forth. And what do they think of all of this? Well, in verse 19, we hear some sarcasm. Let God make speed. Let him hasten his work that we may see it. Let the purpose of the Holy One of Israel draw near and come to pass that we may know it. The picture here is not of people who are being sincere, but they're being sarcastic. They are mocking the message of coming judgment. Isaiah is telling them, listen, you people are going to pay for this. You're going to regret the way you've been living. You've been living in this self-conceited, arrogant, materialistic way. You've forgotten about God, and you will regret it. And what is their response? They act as if nothing's going to happen. Oh, you think God's going to do something, Isaiah? Well, let God do. Let him do something. Let us see it. They have no belief in the message. Keep that in mind. We're going to hear that again in chapter 6. They justify themselves in verse 20 by calling evil good and good evil. I don't know about you, but just about any day of the week you can open up the newspaper or watch the evening news and see exactly that same thing happening in our world today. That people doing horrible things and trying to justify it by appealing to some sense that this is a good thing to do or a right thing to do in some way. And God calls them out. Don't try to justify yourself by saying that this is good. You're calling evil good and good evil. And you're switching the light and the darkness and the bitter and the sweet. And the picture is not of people who are able to convince God that they're actually right. God sees through this charade. They're only trying to justify themselves, but when everything is exposed, all you see is a perversion of good and right. Verse 21, they are arrogant. Of course, that in a sense kind of summarizes the whole thing. And in verse 22 and 23, they are corrupted. They're devoid of sense. That's this sense here of being heroes when it comes to drinking wine and valiant men when it comes to mixing strong drink. That's what they're really good at, and they brag about that and all of this, but they have no sense They are drunk on themselves and their own power, and the result is a wicked situation. So in verses 24 and 25, God says, I'm going to burn it up like dry grass in a flame, like a root that becomes rot and the blossom that blows away in the dust, that I'm going to consume them because they have rejected the law of the Lord and despised the Lord's word. The anger of the Lord burns against this people. He stretches out his hand and he will strike them down, and their corpses will lay unceremoniously and unhonorably in the middle of the street, as it were. That this will be their end. Nothing great, nothing high, nothing exalted, nothing proud, nothing honorable, but God will completely abase them. And we find out at the end of the chapter here that God is going to do this by calling a foreign nation to come, a foreign nation that has no mercy or pity. They do not slumber or sleep. They are well equipped. The belt at the waist is not undone. The sandal strap is not broken. They are fully equipped. They have sharp arrows. They have strong horses. They come, they seize their prey and carry it off with no one to deliver them. This is how God is going to bring about this judgment, by using a foreign nation against his own people to judge their wickedness. That brings us then to chapter 6, and we're going to slow down a little bit next time and just look at chapter 6 because it's such an important text. But I hope that this brief survey of chapters 3, 4, and 5 has been helpful.